Welcome to episode 3 of the Inside Elections podcast, where we analyze elections in a nonpartisan, data-driven, and accessible way. In this episode, what do the latest fundraising numbers tell us about the state of the presidential race, who made a splash in House and Senate fundraising, and which losing candidates from 2022 have the best chance of winning their comeback in 2024. And I'll tell you where to find the cheapest gas in Ohio. Buckle up. Hello, I'm Nathan Gonzales, and I just got back from Indiana's 3rd District.
I'm Jacob Rubashkin, and I am on my way to Delaware's at-large district.
Hey everyone, I'm Erin Covey, and I just got back from Greece. Not sure which district I was in for their legislative body, but I did go to like one of the old Senate houses at the Agora in Athens, which was super cool.
So we're not talking about Athens, Georgia. You went to actual Greece.
I think that's where Joe Biden got his start when he first got to the Senate.
It is, yeah. He's been in back office there around 500 BC.
So a little differently, in Indiana's 3rd District, that's where my wife's family is from. And so our kids get to spend time at grandma's house in a real yard with real grass. And but I also got to go to the Adams County Fair and follow, I think, 3 congressional candidates running for Jim Banks' seat. I tweeted about it. I should write about it a little bit later, but it was fun to get out in the Midwest. Before we get into our 3 big stories, what are some news events that folks shouldn't miss? Erin, go first.
Yeah, so we have some redistricting updates in Alabama for those of y'all who have been following along with that saga. So the Republican-controlled State House and Senate each passed new congressional maps, though it appears fairly likely that neither map will pass federal court scrutiny. So the legislature was required to produce a map with 2 districts that are either majority Black or something quite close to it. That was the exact quote from the court order. And so the 2 new proposed maps from the Republican-controlled state legislature include second districts that are respectively 38% Black and 42% Black, which isn't particularly close to a majority. And so a lot of folks are expecting that these maps probably will not hold up in court, but we'll see what happens.
There's a joke about Alabama and math in there somewhere, but I won't go fully there. But Republicans are taking a risk that if they don't draw a map that is in compliance, then the court's going to draw it, and it's probably not going to be as favorable as what they want. Jacob, what should folks not miss?
So New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, who is a Republican, announced that he would not seek a 5th 2-year term in office. This is the 3rd big race that Sununu has passed on in the last couple of years. If you remember, he was recruited very heavily to run for Senate against Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan. He said no. There was a lot of speculation that he might run for president. He said no to that as well. Now he's not running for governor either. This makes the New Hampshire the best pickup opportunity for Democrats in terms of gubernatorial races. They've already got 2 candidates in the race, Executive Counselor Cindy Warmington and Manchester Mayor Joyce Craig. Republican field is also already growing. Former Senator Kelly Ayotte, former State Senate President Chuck Morse, and Education Commissioner Frank Edelblut are all already running for the GOP nomination.
Now, is Ayotte running? Because I know there was some confusion on Twitter yesterday.
That's true. She has promised a big announcement in the coming days. I think the expectation is she is going to be running. I'll be more precise on that. I don't think we have an official announcement yet, or at least not a real one. But okay. That's the expectation.
Good to know.
And with that news and with the Dave Reichert news in Washington State a couple weeks ago, this is turning out to be some very interesting gubernatorial races. This is kind of a down cycle in terms of the number of governor's races, but it's actually starting to be very interesting. And I want to make sure people don't miss something that Jacob, you tweeted about recently, and that is Never Back Down. The Ron DeSantis friendly super PAC aired an ad using AI to mimic former President Donald Trump's voice, to mimic the criticism that he had of Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds that was previously just on social media and in a press release. Now, the American Association of Political Consultants has condemned that act or condemned using AI in that way. But I have a feeling it's something that's not going to be enough to prohibit campaigns or to deter campaigns from using this in the future. So we're all going to have to be careful and watch for those tactics in ads in the future.
Yeah, and this is actually the second time that a DeSantis entity or affiliated group has used AI. If you remember, the DeSantis campaign put out a video a couple days or about a week or two ago that included AI generated images of Donald Trump hugging Anthony Fauci, scenes that didn't actually take place and that were not listed as artificially generated. In fact, the caption on the screen actually said "a real Trump." When those images were displayed. So this is quickly becoming a pattern for that part of the political world.
It's probably the case where if you have to put real, that probably means it's not. That might be a tip off. That might be a tip off in the future. The Inside Elections podcast is sponsored by George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management, or GSPM. The GSPM program offers master's degrees in legislative affairs and political management with in-person and online class schedules designed for the working professional. As I've said before, the program is not just a sponsor, but I'm a graduate. And in one class, we had to make campaign plans for the candidates in the 2004 Illinois Senate race. At the time of that race, it was Barack Obama against Republican Jack Ryan, and actually used some of the research that I did for that class project to turn it into an op-ed that ended up getting picked up by the Wall Street Journal. So I was able to use it in multiple places. So please click on the link, check out what the GSPM program has to offer. Let's dive into our top stories. Our first story, campaign fundraising and the state of the presidential race.
So we got our first real look at the financial health of some of the major presidential campaigns this cycle when those groups had to file their quarterly fundraising reports with the Federal Elections Commission. Now, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis posted the largest haul among Republicans, but his filings also showed a number of pretty significant red flags. While Trump and South Carolina Senator Tim Scott reported having the most money left to spend in the bank at the end of the quarter on June 30th. Meanwhile, Mike Pence, the former vice president, and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie posted some pretty middling numbers that raised some concerns about their campaigns as well. And then on the other side of the aisle, President Joe Biden raised a combined $72 million through all of his various party committees and the DNC, a pretty substantial haul that put to rest some concerns about the president's fundraising ability heading into his reelection.
So, Jacob, that word combined that you said is doing a lot of work, because the way that candidates are reporting numbers these days is out of control, in my view, that sometimes candidates are reporting entities that shouldn't even be that should be independent of the campaign, but they're lumping them together to have a higher fundraising number. So talk about that challenge a little bit.
Yeah, so there are a lot of different things going on here, especially when it comes to presidential campaigns, right? Every one of these candidates more or less has a super PAC that is also supporting them. And those are legally distinct and independent organizations that aren't allowed to communicate with the candidates privately, at least, and can raise unlimited sums of money. So you hear a lot about that DeSantis super PAC we talked about earlier and how much money they have, $130 million or something like that. And that is a separate group that is ostensibly unaffiliated. We all know in reality they are all working toward the same goal, but those are the super PAC sides. Every candidate has one of those. But even just looking at the candidates themselves, right? In presidential races, it's not just about the particular candidate's principal committee, right? In a congressional race, a candidate might have one committee through which they raise money, and you look at that number and you know the whole story. But in presidential races, what we find is that candidates have a number of different entities under their umbrella, not just a principal campaign committee, but victory committees and things like that, that are often on different reporting schedules. And so it becomes a much more complicated process to come up with a sum total for a candidate's fundraising. So I'll give you two examples. President Joe Biden said he raised $72 million in the last quarter, right? But his principal campaign committee only raised about 20 million. So where did that extra 52 million come from? Well, it came from the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, which is the main organ of the Democratic Party. And because Biden is the president, it is part of his operation. It also came from 50 different, or actually 51 probably different victory committees that are joint fundraising committees with the various state Democratic parties. So every single state, be it Wyoming or New York, has entered into an agreement with the Biden campaign to make a joint committee that can also accept campaign contributions. And so all of that tallied up gets you to that $72 million number. Not all of that has actually been reported because some of those committees are on a monthly schedule as opposed to a quarterly schedule. If you also look at the Donald Trump campaign, right, they came out and they said, we raised $35 million, but their filing actually only showed raising $17 million into their principal committee. Where did that other $18 million go? Well, it went to the various Trump victory committees and other PACs that he's set up, some of which aren't even paying for campaign expenses. They're really there to pay for the president's or the former president's burgeoning legal bills.
Right. So, Erin, what stood out to you if we bring, talking about this presidential race, what stood out to you in terms of weak or strong fundraising among the candidates?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty straightforward, like with what Jacob said. I think the warning signs that Jacob had mentioned about DeSantis's fundraising, I think were mostly the fact that he was spending so much this quarter and his burn rate was pretty high. And so that coincided with some news about his campaign having to lay off some staffers as they're concerned about building up their war chest ahead of a very competitive campaign in the coming months. And so I think there are some warning signs there. However, he's still raising more than any of his competitors at this point. And so it doesn't mean that his campaign is over. It just means that they're going to need to do some restructuring ahead of the primaries.
Because spending isn't necessarily bad, right? Tim Scott's campaign spent a lot of money, but they were spending on future TV buys,
Right.
Which will, be useful, more useful in the future than ads or than staffing currently. I went back and tried to compare apples to apples, even red apples to red apples on fundraising. If you put that Biden 72 million, that joint combined number into perspective, I believe 4 years ago, President Trump at the second quarter of 2019 raised more than 100 million. And so in one way, Republicans could say, oh, Biden's struggling and he's not doing as well, but Trump lost the 2020 race, right? Like just because you're raising more money doesn't mean that you're going to win. And to me, the best thing that Biden can do to get reelected is to do a good job. I mean, you need the money to run a campaign, but ultimately, if enough voters don't think that the country's headed in the right track, or they feel secure, they feel strong about the direction of the economy, then there's almost no amount of money that Biden's going to be able to raise that's going to convince people otherwise.
Yeah. He also has a pretty lean campaign operation right now. He doesn't have a ton of staffers on his payroll. He's not spending a lot on ads at this point in the cycle. And so I think those numbers will matter a lot more the closer we actually get to the general election.
And he doesn't have anywhere close to the same primary that Trump is facing.
Yeah.
And Jacob, you mentioned those legal fees that Trump is taking some of that campaign money and paying for legal fees. And, there could be, it looks like there are going to be more indictments coming down the road.
Yeah, and I think, Nathan, to your point, and Erin, to your point about the concerns about DeSantis, right? I think this is a big deal because it's part of a larger picture, right? If DeSantis were doing well in the race, if he were rising in the polls, if he were getting favorable reviews, and he came out with this campaign finance report, I think people would be reading it very differently. But it's the fact that his campaign had that bumpy launch, has been on a slump for the last several months, has really seemed to be in a rut, that when it comes out that not only is he spending a lot of money, but he's already tapped out a lot of his top donors. He's already raised a significant portion that he can't touch in the primary election. And that he's having to let go staffers. It just kind of snowballs into a larger narrative about the direction his campaign is headed in. And that's why we've seen them, be very explicit about doing a reset. I mean, this guy's been in the race for 5 weeks, and he's already doing a reset of his campaign. He's talking to CNN after more than a year of completely stonewalling traditional media. Clearly, they recognize that they have to make some substantial changes in the campaign at this early stage in order to remain viable moving forward, despite the fact that, as they are quick to tell you, they're raising more money than anyone else in the field.
So let's quickly do pick one candidate from the second, third, or fourth tier and their fundraising number and something that stuck out to you. Erin, which one candidate?
Yeah. So, one specific quirk of this cycle is that the RNC's debate requirements require candidates to have a certain number of raw donors. So, that's not like a specific amount fundraised, but a number of individual contributions. And so, a lot of these second and third tier candidates are trying to find creative ways to reach that number while still potentially actually losing money in the long run. And so you've seen Doug Burgum, who is very wealthy, the governor of North Dakota. Not a lot of folks know who he is, but he has a ton of money. And so he's been able to spend a lot on TV really early on. So he has been incentivizing donors to donate at least $1, and the campaign will send them a $20 gift card. So he could potentially lose a ton of money through this scheme, but it will also enable him to reach the 40,000 donor threshold that he'll need to hit in order to make the debate stage. And so I think there's some questions about like how legal this is. It's murky waters, and I'm not going to dive into that, but I think it's interesting and notable what the links that these candidates are going just to make sure they can get onto that national stage.
You can't buy votes, but can you buy contributions? We'll be figuring that out later. Jacob, who stuck out to you?
Yeah, I'll just say, if you're Doug Burgum's counsel or compliance officer, please, my DMs are open because I'm very interested in the memo you had to write to clear
Yes.
that scheme. I think what stood out to me, and not in a good way, was former Vice President Mike Pence. He raised about $1.2 million, which is a really paltry sum, especially for a former vice president. I think when he got in the race, there was a question that a lot of people had of, what is his path? What is his lane? Who is he doing this for? And even though he is in usually third place, though perhaps fourth place now in a lot of the national polls, there clearly is not an appetite among the donor base for a Mike Pence presidency, let alone one that they're going to donate to. And so, I think he will make the debate stage. He certainly met the polling threshold, but he has not yet met that donor threshold, the 40,000 donors necessary to make that first debate stage. And so it's been notable to see some of these other less traditional candidates or candidates with a smaller footprint than a former vice president outraising him. But that's something that he's really going to have to turn around if he wants to become a serious contender to beat Trump and win the nomination.
And speaking of lack of appetite among the donors, I think Nikki Haley's fundraising also, was very pedestrian. On one hand, she is an impressive candidate, a former governor, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, but she just doesn't have that appeal to the donor base as compared to a governor Ron DeSantis, for example. So I think she's a serious contender, but she's going to have to raise more money to compete, even with her South Carolina colleague Tim Scott. All right, let's move on. Our second story is fundraising again, this time in congressional races.
No. Show you the money. Not show you. Show me the money. Show me the money. Yeah! Louder! Show me the money!
So, Nathan, what stood out to you in these House and Senate reports that we got to look at?
Well, the first thing is the Senate. I feel like a little bit of, in the words of former New York Yankees catcher Yogi Berra, deja vu all over again, because we have vulnerable Democratic senators continuing to raise millions of dollars, just adding to their campaign accounts, and we have Republicans either struggling to raise money, or in some races, top tier Republicans not in races yet. I know that there's the strategy the Republicans have where say, well, if we get wealthy candidates, then we won't need to compete as much as fundraising. But there's no guarantee that there's not a guarantee that Governor Jim Justice in West Virginia is going to be the nominee, or there's no guarantee that Tim Sheehy in Montana that we talked about on the previous episode is going to be the nominee. And so if their wealthy candidates don't get in or are not the nominee, then we're back to what happened in 2022, where Democratic senators used their fundraising advantage. They were able to air more ads because they get the cheaper rate, and they have a better chance of holding the majority. But Erin, what stuck out to you in the second quarter numbers, either the Senate or on the House side?
Yeah, I think my main takeaway was on the House side, which is that the Republicans who are running in competitive districts are actually doing a lot better than the Democrats who are running in competitive districts, at least this past quarter. And I think that is because of a very intentional strategy on the NRCC's part to direct more funds directly to the candidates themselves rather than to the committee. Because historically, House Republicans have struggled in comparison to their Democratic counterparts in fundraising for these races, like we saw in 2022. A lot of times the Republican spending was carried by the super PAC, mostly by the Congressional Leadership Fund, which is House Republicans' main super PAC, and they were the ones who were doing the bulk of the actual spending on TV, which obviously was a huge help. And the Republican super PAC outraised the Democrats super PAC a lot. But those dollars will not go as far when super PACs are spending them versus when campaigns are spending them. So the Republicans are definitely making a much more concerted effort to boost their candidates directly this cycle. And we'll see if that pays off and if that trend continues. But I think I'm pulling up a roll call analysis.
Was this Herb's story?
Yes.
Herb Jackson.
Yeah.
Please, if you all have not read Herb's breakdown in roll call, please. Great story. And if you guys could see the spreadsheet that he puts together, it's impressive. But anyway, go ahead, Erin.
Yeah. So, according to his analysis, which is based on the seats that we have rated as competitive at Inside Elections, the average Democratic incumbent raised 420,000 during the second quarter, and then the average Republican incumbent raised 639,000 in the second quarter. So that's a $200,000 difference, pretty significant. You had three Republicans who are running in competitive districts um, raise more than $1 million this past quarter, and there were no Democrats who were able to hit that threshold. And so I think this definitely shows momentum on the Republican side. We'll see if that continues. Kind of in a reverse of the Senate situation, there's still quite a few competitive districts where Democrats have yet to actually announce campaigns yet, but they have potentially strong recruits that are in the wings. So we'll see how that evolves over the next couple of quarters. But right now, I think this is a good sign for Republicans.
And I think those 3 million plus fundraisers were what? Michelle Steele and Young Kim in Southern California and Brian Fitzpatrick in Pennsylvania?
Yes, that's correct. And ironically, these are all Republicans who are relatively safe compared to a lot of their other counterparts. Like we have all three of these seats rated as likely Republican. And so they're already probably going to be in a stronger position than some of the other Republicans who are defending.
But in tough districts, right? And to me, those three are in a category, right? They're not in our toss-up. They're not in our toss-up rating. But if Trump is the nominee, which he's the front runner, but then as the general election progresses and he somehow implodes, those are the type of districts where their races could get very competitive very quickly, and they're going to need all that money in order to defend themselves. Jacob, who or what stuck out to you in those second quarter numbers?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of things. Nathan, you mentioned the Republican strategy of finding wealthy candidates to run in these top tier Senate races. The filing from Jim Justice really stood out to me. He raised a little over $900,000. He did not spend any of his own money on that race, and I think it is still an open question, perhaps more of an open question than some people who talk about this race treat it, about how much money of his own Jim Justice will spend on this Senate race. He traditionally has not spent a ton of his own money on his two gubernatorial contests, and so I think it's an open question. I also think that, frankly, it's not an amazing sum for a sitting governor who was the prized recruit of the National Party in his cycle. And especially when you kind of dig into the details, he tapped a lot of max out donors. His average contribution was $170, which is very high. To raise $935,000 off of about 5,000 donors, you got to have a lot of people who are giving big checks. So I think it'll be interesting to see if he can step up the fundraising game, especially if the Club for Growth really does come in and spend $10 million against him, like they have said that they will. I think, to Erin's point, to me, the big thing was in a lot of these challenger races in California, where you have these well-funded Republican incumbents, Democrats are struggling to raise money against Young Kim, against Michelle Steele. You've got candidates who raise around $100,000 for a 3-month quarter in one of the most expensive media markets in the country. Which is just not going to cut it. And so if Democrats want to regain some of that California territory back, they're really going to need to step up the fundraising there as well.
And one California Democrat that's not struggling to raise money is Senate candidate Adam Schiff, who I believe ended the second quarter with $29+ million in his campaign account. That would not include a fundraising email that went out about, I think it was last week, from Mark Hamill. If you don't know who Mark Hamill is, you are, I think, still allowed to listen to this podcast, but he would be Luke Skywalker from the Star Wars movies, who is on sent out a fundraising email for Adam Schiff. So if I can make one point that I hear every time, I feel like every quarter, about candidates running in longer shot races. This time, Adam Frisch running against Lauren Boebert. Now, that was an extremely closest race in the country in 2022. He put together $2.6 million. But it's not it's a Republican leaning district, probably even more so in a presidential year. But I could foresee frustration that, well, that money that's given to him would be better spent in more competitive seats or more competitive districts. And I just don't think fundraising is always a zero sum game, that there are lots of Democratic donors who want to give to Lauren Boebert's challenger who are just not going to be as excited giving against John James or some other Republican. But I don't know. Maybe I have the wrong view of it. You both can tell me if I'm wrong on that point.
I don't think it's a zero sum game, but I think it is horrendous the amount of money that is being spent on campaigns at this point in general.
Yeah, I don't think it's a zero sum game either. I think that for some people, right, the act of donating is not it's not this kind of very utilitarian, I want to give my dollar so that it has the most impact in whatever sort of theater, so it increases the number of, udals by not udalls, but, units of utility across the country. I think some people like to give money because it makes them feel good and it makes them feel like they're doing their part. It's an expression of their political belief, and so there's more to it than just giving the money where you get the most bang for your buck. I will say, though, I don't think Frisch's race is the best example of this, because we have seen that that district has the potential to be highly competitive. So I would put that one perhaps in a different situation than, whichever Democrat ultimately runs against Marjorie Taylor Greene, for instance, is going to raise an insane amount of money. And that I can understand the frustration, especially when you do have these races that go underfunded, that end up very close, as opposed to races that are awash with cash that, end up in blowouts.
And we had a whole barrage of candidates who announced this month, the beginning of the third quarter. Erin, you wrote about a lot of these candidates for the newsletter, but tell us about House rematches and what's in store.
Yeah, so we have a lot of familiar faces who are going to be on the ballot next year who ran for Congress in 2022. And so it'll be really interesting to see how these candidates do the second time around. There definitely are some advantages to candidates who ran and lost last cycle and who are running again. They're better known now by voters, so they're not starting from scratch with name ID. They're not starting from scratch with their campaign infrastructure. A lot of these folks are using the same teams that they used last cycle. They have fundraising networks developed already. And so it puts them usually in the second time in a stronger position than they were in the first time. However, if they do lose again and run again, then they could run the risk of turning into perennial candidates who are just known for losing. So, but for the candidates who are running for their second time, I think that we have to make an important distinction there. These are not perennial candidates. These are candidates who a lot of time came very close last cycle, and they're hoping that they're going to be running in a better environment this cycle. They'll be able to maybe learn from some of their mistakes last cycle, and they could have a chance to win.
So people can read all the names in your story, but just give us a taste here of some of the most interesting or consequential rematches that are on the docket.
Yeah, so I'll run through some of the recent ones. So you had Rudy Salas in California's 22nd district. He just announced he's running again. He ran against David Valadao last cycle, and that was one of the most competitive races in the nation. And then you have Monica Trinnell in Montana, who is running against Ryan Zinke again. You have Tony Vargas in Nebraska, who is running against Don Bacon again. You have Tom Barrett in Michigan, who is not running against Slotkin again because she is running for Senate. So he'll probably be facing Curtis Hertel, who looks like the likely Democratic nominee at this point. But since he was just on the ballot in this district last cycle, he's definitely in a stronger position.
And Jacob, which rematch is getting you the most excited?
That's a good question. I think that there are any number that have the potential to be really interesting. I think out in New York, again, we've talked about this before. I'm partial to New York's 19th district because it's where I went to college. But in that race, Mark Molinaro, the Republican incumbent, probably going to be facing a rematch with Josh Riley, the Democrat who he beat narrowly in last year's election. There's the potential for a rematch down in New York's 3rd district, in New York's 4th district between Anthony D'Esposito, the Republican incumbent, and Laura Gillen, his Democratic opponent from last cycle. I think New York was not the focus of a lot of Democratic attention last year, and to disastrous results for the party, quite frankly. They didn't realize how much trouble they were in until the last couple weeks. And so with that renewed attention and a lot more money flowing into those races, I think those rematches have the potential to be quite interesting, especially if Democrats successfully are able to redraw the New York congressional map to be more favorable to their candidates.
And we've talked a lot about Oregon politics, and we will continue to talk about it in Oregon's 5th district. There could be a double rematch, or Jamie McLeod Skinner could be the Democratic nominee again against Lori Chavez de Remer. But McLeod Skinner needs to make it through the primary. One of the other Democratic candidates, Janelle Bynum, previously faced Chavez de Remer in 2 state house races. So there could be a rematch there. I have to get something off my chest, though, in that one of the things I hate about how the committees and sort of the press people handle these races of losing candidates to say, well, if they lost, then voters have rejected them, and that that's the end of the game. And that is, I want to bring up 2 examples in history that folks, depending on how old you are that are listening, in Indiana's 9th district in 2002, Democratic Congressman Barron Hill defeated a Republican named Mike Sodrell. Sodrell ran again in 2004 and defeated Barron Hill. Now, Barron Hill ran again in 2006 and defeated Sodrell. They faced each other again in 2008. Barron Hill prevailed again. one of my favorite ones is also in New Hampshire 1, New Hampshire's first district. 2010, Republican Frank Ginta defeated Democratic Congresswoman Carol Shea Porter. In 2012, Shea Porter defeated Ginta. 2014, Ginta defeated Shea Porter. 2016, Shea Porter defeated Ginta. So all sorts of rematches with different outcomes. The bottom line is, just because someone has lost a race does not mean that they can't win a future race. A lot of it has to do with the political environment and even sometimes things outside of the candidate's control. So I'll get off my soapbox, even though that's why we have this podcast, I guess, is to have a soapbox. But I was like, I just get so frustrated.
Nathan,
I agree.
We were talking about kind of the California races, and I think one of the other rematches that is going to be, I would wager, one of the most competitive races in the country is in California's 41st district between Republican Ken Calvert and Will Rollins, who lost a closer than expected race in 2022. I think this is a good example, Erin, to what you were saying about the benefits of running for a second time, right? Last time, Rollins had to get through a primary. There was another Democrat in that race. It was a district that Democrats weren't really prioritizing. And, they had a lot of other opportunities in California they thought were more attractive. And now, after he got within about 6 points of Ken Calvert last time, he's back. He's cleared the field. He's got the full support of the Democratic Party. Every, I think, Democratic member of Congress in California has endorsed him. He's raising more money than almost any other challenger in not just California, but around the country, I would imagine, in the Democratic Party, close to $1 million in his most recent quarter. And, I think that he's really, probably the example of building on the success of last cycle's unsuccessful run in order to launch an even more competitive campaign this time around. So we'll see if he's able to get over the finish line. But I think that one is going to be pretty interesting as well.
And if you're a subscriber, you can see the ratings for each individual race in every newsletter. And if you're not a subscriber, you can also still see the ratings at InsideElections.com. Just move to the right hand side. You just get the deeper, in-depth analysis in the newsletter. But let's move on.
If you have any criticisms, feel free to just subtweet us, and I'm sure we'll run into it eventually. No need to tell us directly.
There we go. As long as Twitter still exists, right? We'll be accepting those subtweets. And finally, our last segment, Look What I Found, where we highlight something new we've stumbled across. It doesn't have to be politics. It could be music, movies, television. You just never know what you're going to get with this segment. Jacob, what did you find?
So I found a great summer wine, the Espiral Vinho Verde from Trader Joe's. It's bright, crisp, bubbly, green, and best of all, it is just $5 a bottle.
I went through a phase where I bought that quite a bit, like a couple of summers ago. It's a very good wine. It's very cheap too.
Yes, are there other things going on? No,
so.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I know, that sounds compelling.
My deadlines I'm imposing on you? No.
This was a while ago.
Hey, Erin, what did you find?
So, as I mentioned earlier, this sounds so annoying because now I'm turning into that person who just talks about their vacation constantly. But I was in Greece for the past week, and so I haven't really been thinking about much outside of that. But while we were there, we did find a beach while we were kayaking to try to get to a different beach, and accidentally kayaked like way past it and ended up at a beach where there were only a couple of other boats. It was not accessible by land, so it was incredibly peaceful and the kind of beach that you want to find. But if you go to like Google Maps and you click on a beach and the reviews say, oh, this is a great secluded beach, it's not going to be secluded because it means it's been discovered at this point. This was an actual secluded beach. So really enjoyed it. I will eventually probably tweet some photos out there.
A little more difficult to replicate than Jacob's recommendation, but people can follow along.
If you're going to Skopelos sometime soon, DM me.
And on a very different note, I found the cheapest place to get gas in Ohio. Actually, I need to give credit to my late father-in-law. We drive from DC to Indiana multiple times a year to visit family. And the Kent State University exit off of 76, there's a BP station. It's always cheaper than everything else, but it's cheap, but it's also not one of those places that's sketchy that you feel like your credit card's guaranteed to get skimmed if you get gas there. So if you're driving across Ohio, check out the BP station. We are not a sponsor of that BP station. We get no money from it, but it's we're open to it. If you're listening and you're the owner of that, we're open to being sponsored by it. But so yeah, I know that's what I found. That's all the time we have. We got smarter about what the latest fundraising numbers mean for the presidential race and the fights for the House and the Senate, and looked at emerging rematches in the House. And it's all in the context of a competitive 2024 election where the House and Senate majorities and the White House are on the line. Thank you for joining us. At Inside Elections, we provide nonpartisan analysis of congressional, presidential, and gubernatorial races. With a combination of reporting and data, we break down the key races and bring valuable context to these complex elections. Please go to InsideElections.com to subscribe to the bi-monthly newsletter. We have individual subscriptions as well as group packages that are tailor-made for association and corporate PACs. If you liked this episode and you've already become a fan of all of these, please subscribe, leave us a comment, hit the thumbs up on YouTube. We appreciate all of that. If you didn't like today's episode, let's have you email George Santos. He can't go outside of a certain radius of the city, so he probably has some spare time to respond to you. We also wanted to thank our producers, Alan Tazinski and Melissa Lenner of Pretty Easy Podcasts, and our associate producer, Conrad Tolosa. Thank you, and please join us again next time.